Hey everybody, KMO here. Look at this, short sleeves. It's in the 70s. But notice the trees, they ain't buying it. I haven't seen a single green leaf yet this year. The trees are not convinced. So this morning I got up and as is my habit, unfortunately, I got into the recliner with my cup of coffee and my tablet, and I went to play some video games, but I didn't play the video games. Instead, I watched a YouTube video. It was a BBC story with a young female BBC reporter who comes to the United States to do a story about how the fastest growing suicide demographic are middle-aged white men. Like me. I'm not contemplating suicide, by the way. But she went to Montana, and she talked to the families of people who had lost loved ones, and she talked to an older white gentleman who had contemplated suicide, maybe attempted it, and then didn't, and he explained what was going on for him and why he was feeling such despair and loneliness. And at the end of it, I noticed that the comments had been disabled, and I could just imagine the sorts of comments that would accompany a video that described how middle-aged white men were committing suicide at much greater rates than other demographics. I mean, imagine it. Imagine the sorts of comments that must have been posted to get somebody to disable comments on that video, or what sort of comments they anticipated, which caused them to, disable comments preemptively. And then, on a video that I shot a few weeks ago, in fact, behind me, can't really see him, I guess, but between my chin and that tree, there's a couple plastic chairs. I was sitting in one of those chairs when I made a video. I think it was Peak Oil Bullshit Part 5. And this morning somebody posted a comment. Get Some Regan posted, Seneca Cliff is the fasting of a system. So in that video, I think I was still on my fast. I probably was talking about peak oil and mixing it with fasting, with the concept of fasting. And while this comment from Get Some Regan seems, sort of half-baked and just sort of dashed off and not really thought out, I've been thinking about it. Seneca Cliff is the fasting of a system. What is a Seneca Cliff? A Seneca Cliff is an idea popularized by a peak oil guy, one of the Club of Rome members, named Ugo Bardi. And he's basically just the observation that, when we look at oil depletion rates from the peak oil perspective, we usually envision this symmetrical bell curve. But systems that grow at a certain rate can fall off or decline at a much faster rate. So instead of this smooth curve up and then a little plateau and an equally smooth curve down, you get the smooth curve up, the plateau, and then a crash. Peak oil people really like this idea because it supports the idea of a fast and irrevocable collapse of industrial civilization, which lays low, the powerful along with the powerless. It is what I like to call the romantic notion of collapse. But I started thinking about Seneca, because when I first got interested in philosophy back in the late 80s, I was taking philosophy courses at a community college, and about the only thing I remembered about Seneca was that supposedly he approved of suicide, that the wise man chose the means of his own passing. And I went to various sources today and started reading up on Seneca, who was a Stoic, and his position on suicide isn't really central to what he was about or anything like that, but I did read a letter that he wrote to somebody in which he's talking about suicide. And there's a couple of quotes from that letter that I want to share with you. The best thing which eternal law ever ordained was that it allowed to us one entrance into life, but many exits. Must I await the cruelty either of disease or of man, when I can depart through the midst of torture and shake off my troubles? This is the one reason why we cannot complain of life. It keeps no one against his will. Humanity is well situated because no man is unhappy except by his own fault. Live, if you desire. If not, you may return to the place from whence you came. If you would pierce your heart, a gaping wound is unnecessary. A lancet will open the way to that great freedom, and tranquility can be purchased at the cost of a pinprick. Now, what's ironic about that quote is that Seneca did die via suicide, but he committed suicide because he was ordered to by the Emperor Nero. Nero thought that Seneca was involved in a plot to assassinate him, which he probably wasn't. And Seneca, who had written that a pinprick is sufficient to gain you access to that eternal tranquility, he tried to commit suicide by opening his arteries. And yet he didn't bleed very profusely, and his death was very slow. And he took some poison to speed things along, but the poison wasn't really enough to kill him. It just increased his misery. And eventually, because he wasn't bleeding very much, he got into a warm bath, hoping that the warm bath would cause the blood flow to increase and end his misery. But it didn't really work very well, and he died in lingering agony. But what does that have to do with peak oil and with collapse? Well, I fasted recently. I did a 10-day fast, and I discovered that the first few days of the fast, and this wasn't a new discovery, it's sort of a rediscovery, but the first few days of the fast were the most agitated and uncomfortable. You know, really the first and second day are the days when at least I feel hungry, and I think most people have the same experience on a long fast. The early days are the roughest. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, you know, you can go to places like Peru. I mean, I just pulled that one out of the hat because that's a place I've been repeatedly, where people are very, very poor. And the infrastructure compared to what we have here is rudimentary. And, you know, it functions, it half functions, you might say. But it's enough. It's enough to provide stability. It is enough for people to get up out of bed and go to work every day. It is enough to keep the society or the civilization shambling along, staggering, stumbling, but not falling. And, you know, if it does fall, it gets up again. And what we have here in the so-called first world, in the United States and Canada and Australia and Great Britain and basically the places that were on the U.S. side of the Cold War, we have so much comfort that if we were to be thrust into an involuntary fast, if we were to have some sort of drastic cutback in the energy throughput of this society, we would discover first that it seems like death. It seems like the world has ended, that we are in the midst of the living death that is horrible. But then, as the situation continues and we don't die, we discover that we had a lot more than we needed. And we also discover that we can be happier on a lot less than we thought we needed. And it wouldn't be until the metaphorical 9th or 10th day of the fast that we discovered just how made up so many of our so-called needs were. How culturally conditioned they were. How we had to be inculcated into thinking that we couldn't live without certain comforts, certain procedures and priorities, certain standards. But that we can not only live without them, but we're actually happier without them. And I say all this full in the knowledge that I sound a bit like Seneca, saying, hey, you know, you're not forced to be here. If you're still drawing breath, it is by your own choice. And suicide is painless, you know, to quote the MASH theme song. But it isn't, or not always. It wasn't for Seneca. And it probably won't be for us either. So, no leaves on the trees, but as you can hear, the birds are singing. And there will be new life. I'll talk to you again tomorrow.